Hello and welcome to this video tutorial on how we go about creating the Unreal War gaming bases for Titsnicus. To begin the video, I'll be showing off the bases. I was lucky enough to be involved in the Kickstarter campaign. Had a few bases sent to me. So this is the oval base for the Reaver Titan. We'll be looking at larger Warlord Titan bases as well as a Warhound base. I want this to go alongside my Legio Solaris, not Solaria, Legio Solaris. It's a homebrew Titan Legion that we developed on the Age of Darkness podcast. You see the preview here. I'm very proud of that tutorial produced for that Titan. You can find it on the Age of Darkness Facebook website. Here's a look at the bases. One of the things that stopped me, or I was hesitant with diving into Titsnicus, was a lack of bases. Most of the things in this hobby, especially surrounding Warhammer, it tends to be in the 28mm range. That's why I think Inquisitor was so hard to get into in the day, because we didn't have the infrastructure, we didn't have the bases, we didn't have the things that were in scale. So if you wanted a Marine, buying a Marine and putting it on a base of a 28mm miniature, pretty easy to do. In this scale, it doesn't work. We don't have that resource unless you want to pay eBay prices for old epic stuff, which is something I didn't want to do. Now with these bases, I'm able to tell a story. I'm able to contextualize the miniatures themselves. To begin the painting process, we undercoat using Badger Black, Badger Undercoat Black. We on the side of the bottle, it does advise that you leave it for about 48 hours, 24 to 48 hours before you begin painting on top of it. I'm an impatient soul. I started within, I think it was 3 hours, and I used a hairdryer to help speed up the painting, the drying process. I've used a mixture of khaki brown and charred brown, mixed up 50-50, and painted across the surface of the miniature. Now you'll see it's not a completely uniform look. It's not a completely uniform highlight. I don't want to go for uniformity across the entire base, because if you looked at this image, if you looked at aerial photographs, you'll see that the area covered isn't a flat uniform color. It's been blasted, it's been worn, it's been blown up. There'll be different cloud coverages above it. So I want to build up this nuance, this sense of scale through the paint job itself. Khaki brown is built up in some areas, mainly around the periphery of the base, because I know the Reaver will be standing in the center of it. But I'll hit a few panels and I will develop them. And this is pure khaki brown, so empty out the previous mixture from the airbrush. It's 2 part paints to 1 part thinner. And it's at this stage I emptied out the airbrush again and I used ice yellow. But I wasn't too happy with the overall look of what I was achieving. I needed a bit more grit to it. So I took ice yellow, popped it on the top of one of my paints, and I used an old makeup brush that I stole from my wife. And I used this to dry brush the surface of the miniature. Now you can see I wasn't too satisfied with how that dry brush went, so I knocked off even more paint from the brush. We need very, very little paint on the brush. We need it frustrating, so when we add it across the surface, when we run the paintbrush across the surface, it does struggle to impart any kind of paint. We only want to pick up on those sharp-edged details. It's something we are able to do very easily with a dry brush, but very hard to achieve with a regular airbrush or brush. We'd be here all day. Now dry brushing done, I will use another makeup brush, an old battered makeup brush I bought from Boots. I think there was I went out of my way to buy the cheapest one. And I will be using a stippling technique. So this is paint loaded up onto the tip of the brush, completely undiluted. I knock off about 60 to 80% of the moisture from the paint, so you could do that by rubbing it across a piece of kitchen towel. When I stab the surface of the miniature of the base, you can see not much paint is really imparting onto the base. It's mainly picking up on hard edges, as well as imparting those micro fractures that's so hard to recreate and so time consuming to do manually with the tip of a brush. If you take an old battered brush and abuse it, like I'm doing here, you can create really interesting textures in a very short amount of time. But this does rely on the paint being quite thick and undiluted. Not every paint job needs to have 2 thin coats of paint. In this case, we'll be layering thin paints airbrushed with this kind of detailing. Because this stage won't end up perfect, it's not supposed to, it's the underlying structure to the paint job, it's the scaffolding to the paint job. You can see in a few places I'll make some scuffs, I'll make some marks that I'm not too happy with, and that's fine. I can use an airbrush later on to either smooth those areas off, or I can use a slightly different technique to stippling called smudging. So instead of a stippling technique, essentially is putting the airbrush up and down. It's not moving it back and forth. Instead, I'm stabbing the surface of the miniature. Smudging instead is smoothing it back and forth with the same consistency of paint you'd use to stipple and you'd use to dry brush. If you're unsure of exactly what the hell I'm talking about, please observe the video. That's what it's there for. Don't worry so much about defining these techniques. I have to define them as part of the discourse of the videos, trying to build up this language in order to make these videos more descriptive and more effective in teaching you. But sometimes watch me droning on for half an hour can be much better illustrated. The technique I'm trying to describe could be much better illustrated by just watching the video in front of you. So if you are painting right now, you have my dulcet tones on in the background, look up, actually watch the video for a couple of minutes. And for those of you watching already, kudos. You are now a better painter. These brushes don't last very long. I really beat the hell out of them. That's why I buy cheap when it comes to these kind of brushes. Now, if you're unsure, so Boots is it's somewhere you go to buy makeup, it's somewhere you go to buy makeup remover, perfume, crappy presents, Lynx box sets for Christmas, or oh god, what are they called abroad? Axe box sets. If you can't find your own version of Boots, you can buy these brushes. I know through Rosemary & Co. I recently talked to a student and they were hog's hair brushes. If you want more details, please get in touch. I'll forward you on some links. And if there is enough call for it, I'll post up a link in the video below. So in the post below. Okay, now I've stippled the hell out of this base. I want to add some smoothness to it. So I want to smooth some of those harsh edges out. I use the airbrush using ice yellow. This is around about 2 parts thinner to 3 parts paint. And I airbrush this again in not so much random places. I know where the Titan will stand. It's between his legs. I'm airbrushing and highlighting, and on the periphery, wherever the shadow of the Titan does not fall. I do want to give this a broken, fractured appearance, so I'm not highlighting the base uniformly again. Uniformity is the death of interest. Now, once that's done, I take some Agrax Earthshade. I add a small amount of water. And I run the Agrax into the gaps. The aim of this was to give some shadow in the gaps and bring in some different tonal qualities. I don't think this stage was completely successful. I run water across the entirety of the base, then I use Agrax Earthshade, relying on the capillary action of the water to take the Agrax into the gaps and shadows. I'm trying to use Agrax like a pin shade. Like a pin wash here, and it wasn't quite successful. Lupercal green is watered right the hell the way down. You can use boreal tree green or any darker green in your collection for this. I run that into the gaps and recesses on the front, again to add some different tonal qualities to the piece. Now the Agrax didn't really dry that well, it didn't turn out that great. So I resorted to my good old friend oil paints. So you will need some thinner for this. If you've never used oil paints before, there is a primer, there is an introduction to working with oil paints already up on the Patreon. You should find that via the directory, and it will be in the Essentials series. So you can find it there. If you don't know where the directory is, have a look at the About page. So it's the introductory page to the Patreon, and the very first link on that first page is the directory, and you should be able to navigate it through that. But okay, thinning agents, you will need to buy some oil thinner. You get through Winsor & Newton. I mixed that 2 parts thinner to 1 part oil paint. I used lamp black and raw umber. Raw umber was about 80%, 20% lamp black, and I run that into the gaps and recesses of the base. Now you will experience a slight amount of bleed through. That's fine. We want the base to look halfway destroyed. Any blotches, any problems, any slips that you make, you can remove very, very easily for up to a week afterward with further thinner and a paintbrush. Okay, once that's dried, I normally allow about 12 hours to 24 hours for this to dry. Make sure the pin wash or the oil stages are the last thing you do before you go to bed at night. This is the very last thing you do in your hobby time. Then when you come back to it the next day, you're ready and raring to go. I used ice yellow as a stippling technique, again through my all battered makeup brushes. I'm stippling that against the surface yet again. I'm trying to hit the very top portions of the sculpt, the very hardest edges of the sculpt. And I also wanted to introduce a few scrapes in between the pillars themselves, in between those arches. If there are any notes of interest or nodes of interest, so the stairs, you look at the stairs, it's one of those details that immediately jumps out at you. You do want to add a few more layers to that. You do want to make it expressive. You do want to draw the eye to it. So using ice yellow in a stippling technique to give further battered, worn damage to it does give a very pleasing thing for the eye to drift upon. Now you may notice that I'm using a different brush and I'm softening the edges. I don't know what this technique is called. I'm using a stippling technique to add the initial layer, and then I'm using a larger brush that's slightly damp, and I'm tapping it against the periphery. This is to help smooth out any odd transitions I get through the stippling stage. It's there primarily to, I guess, control the the stippling. I'm sorry, it's not like this is a technique that's been used a lot. It's one of those techniques that I just did because it felt natural. And I hope through watching these videos you will be picking up your own way to create your own miniatures. These are never designed to be definitive guides. They are meant to be how I did this, and talking about the reasons why I did these things, the colour recipes. They're here as a guide for you to build up your own working repertoire. But I wish I could think of a name for this. This could be my secret millions right here. If you do have any catchy names, I'm terrible at naming things. I mean, look at the name of my commission, Painting Studio. You can tell I'm very bad at naming things. So if you can think of a name for this new technique, where I stipple, and before the stipple is fully dried, I take another brush and kind of soften it. Write your answers on a postcard and send them to me. No, don't do that. If you do have a good idea, please get in touch with me. I'd love to know. This stipple stage, it isn't a one and done thing. I'm only using ice yellow. I'm not adding any other colours here. I want to preserve the warmth of the underlying layers as much as I can. But I'm building up layers of stippling, one on top of another, in order to give that cracked, broken, brutalised appearance to the base. This isn't just a one coat coverage. Building up in layers gives depth, gives nuance, just gives depth to the destruction of the space. And so far we have only used terrible, cheap brushes. So even though I do recommend using Winsor & Newton, Kolinsky Sable Hair, Raphael A404, the Rosemary & Co., the brush isn't the main vehicle. Your application is the main thing. So you can work wonders with terrible brushes, but it does help having a stipple brush in your collection. Okay, and it helps having really terrible brushes like these that I've bullied. Look at the state of that brush. Okay, Raw Umber by MDP Products, which is Model Display Products. I add a small amount of dry pigment to where the wall has fractured, because I can see in the narrative of the base that would have a lot more dirt and secretion and general build-up of dust from a blown up, broken piece of masonry as opposed to a clean piece of masonry. I load up the brush with the pigment. I knock off excess, then I ram it onto the base. This street dust is used slightly differently. I load up onto the brush and I'll hover it just above the miniature, just above the base, and I'll tap it with one of my fingers in order for the dust to settle in random places above the browner dirt marks. Why? Well, it should become obvious very, very soon. When we apply the binding agent on top, the white will spread out into the brown underneath, but the way the Wilder stuff works, it still preserves the original pigment, so it will seep out into the brown, and when it dries, it will dry pure white. Some of it will mix with the underlying tone, some of it won't. It's one of those chaotic, beautiful things that you need to absorb. You need to put into practice when you start this. Okay, Wilder fixing agent is used with, again, another terrible brush. I'm gently dotting this across the surface. I'm trying not to disturb the pigment where possible. You can run this through an airbrush, but I find I don't like this stuff in the atmosphere. I don't like aerosolizing the Wilder fixer. So my preference here is to use a brush. Even though you can use it through an airbrush, it's my personal preference not to, because I hate this stuff. Just breathing afterwards it's not a pleasant experience. Okay, while it's still drying, I take more street dust by Wilder and I'll knock it very gently onto the base. And that's it. That is the tutorial. I hope you've enjoyed that, guys. Now, while the Legio Solaris scheme is up on the Facebook, so if you type in Age of Darkness podcast, it's one of the few videos we have there. It was one of the older releases and it was live streamed, so the quality of the video isn't the best. There will be a full Maniple tutorial coming up in the very near future when it concerns these guys. If you do want to see any other Titan Legions covered, please get in touch with me. I'd love to know if you want to see maybe one of the Death's Heads, Legio Furians, Legio Solaria, if it's popular enough, if I get enough requests, I'll make a video on it. And that goes for anything. If you want to know fur, skin, whatever, get in touch. I'd love to make a video just for you. Thank you very much. I'll catch you in the next one. Bye-bye.